And joining us now on the Book Talk segment of the show, great to welcome William J. McGee. He's the author of a book called Attention All Passengers, The Airline's Dangerous Descent and How to Reclaim Our Skies. And he joined us today by a telephone from up in Connecticut. And William, thanks for joining us tonight. How are you?
I'm very good. Thanks for having me on.
I was happy to have a chance to read through the book. We all have flown, and we all have had the sometimes horror stories, and we all have some kind of story about airlines. But well, you really get into it. I know you worked for the airlines for a while, or at least you covered it, right? You kind of did both, didn't you?
I did, yeah. I spent about almost 7 years in airline flight operations. I worked I'm an FAA licensed aircraft dispatcher, and I worked for several carriers, including Pan Am, so that sort of dates me a little bit. And for the last 20 years, I've been writing about the industry and serving as a consumer advocate. So altogether, I have about 27 years experience in the industry, so it's been a long journey.
I worked briefly one summer for Eastern Airlines as a ticket agent. So I have a little experience working for the airlines, and Eastern's another airline that went bye-bye.
Yeah, well, the list of airlines that have, gone under since deregulation of the industry in 1978 just keeps getting longer and longer. And, of course, now we're down to a scenario where, as far as the large legacy airlines, as they call them, we're really down to 4 now: American, United, Delta, and U.S. Airways. So I think we're rapidly approaching the too big to fail threshold.
Yeah, I think that's kind of almost the theme of your book, the deregulation. May have done some things good for the consumer, but in other ways, maybe worse. Well, why were airlines deregulated? What was the impetus for that originally in the late 70s?
Well, for those that that aren't aware of what the industry was like, prior to 34 years ago, the government had tremendous control over the entire industry to the point where not only did they decide what airlines would fly on what routes and how often, but they determined the fares even. Government regulators determined how much the fare would be, from Florida to California or what have you. Now, the thought was that it would be a good thing for consumers, and certainly, I try and be fair and balanced here, and I think, there have been some good things that have happened, for consumers through deregulation. My concern is that, the free market forces in the airline industry have just sort of gotten out of control, and at one point, the working title of this book was not Attention All Passengers, but was A Mad Race to the Bottom, because I think that reflects what's going on here. That this cost cutting that most of us see in terms of baggage fees and things like that, it extends beyond that to much more serious issues, including maintenance.
Yeah, I remember as a kid, family would go to Florida two or three times a year, wherever he went, and when my dad bought the tickets, they had, I guess, you had family fares, you had half fares for the kid, but yeah, the fares were pretty much designated by the government. I don't know the government at the time, but they were designated specifically. I guess they were all pretty much the same at that point, right?
That's right. And so, in those days, for many decades, the airlines competed on service because there was no, it was impossible to compete on fares, even if they wanted to.
Yeah. So,
those are the days of, all the advertising campaigns saying, we have the friendliest flight attendants or the best food or the roomiest seats. Those are the things they competed on. Obviously, those days are falling over now.
I remember National Airlines, wouldn't it? The stewardess would come on and say, "I'm Nancy, fly me." Remember those ads?
Right, exactly, yeah.
When they were still called stewardesses.
Similar campaign. Yeah, when Southwest Airlines started up in 1971, they had a similar campaign with, flight attendants wearing hot pants and things like that.
That's right. In some ways, we've lost that. It made flying a little more enjoyable. I mean, but and he said the service as well. I wouldn't say the food was ever good on airlines, but at least you would get hot meals on pretty much all flights, and the deck of cards. I mean, they give stuff away on. I mean, that service thing was the big selling point. Now you're lucky if you get a bag of peanuts and a Coke, right?
Well, you're probably going to pay for the Coke.
Yeah, right.
One of the things that I write about at length in Attention All Passengers is what the industry calls load factors, which is just a term that means the percentage of occupied seats on airplanes. And we're in an area now that we've never really been in before. For a brief time during World War II, the airlines were troop carriers. But, other than that, throughout the whole history of the domestic industry, load factors usually were around 60%. So that basically meant about 6 out of 10 seats were occupied on average. Well, now on average, for U.S. airlines, the last couple of years, we've been seeing average load factors over 80%, which of course means that many flights are at 100%. And I'm sure I'm not telling you or your listeners anything new if you're flown and you think you can just out your imagination that cabins are fuller. And I think those high load factors as the U.S. squeeze more and more passengers into airplanes are actually the unseen force that is making a lot of things much tougher. It leads to more flight delays and cancellations. It leads to more passengers being involuntarily bumped. It leads to more problems with, the fights for the overhead bins with baggage because people don't want to pay the baggage fees. It leads to, 3 people sitting abreast and not having as much, comfort. And even, I think, indirectly to air rage in some cases. Not that I would ever excuse, anyone acting inappropriately. But, these things have all sort of come to a critical mass. The bottom line is that any of us who are old enough to remember flying before 1978 knows that, it's just not a pleasant experience anymore. Most people just refer to it as the hassle factor.
Yeah, you talk a lot about it in the book. I remember, again, going back as a kid when we took family vacations, you almost had to dress up to fly. I mean, people dressed better than they do now. Now it's like riding a bus, right? I mean, people just get on in any old thing. But there's more of a status to it. You go on an airplane, you behave yourself a different way, and I guess that's almost gone too, isn't it?
Well, I have a whole chapter devoted to that issue of air rage. To sort of look, again, I mean, I'm not going to excuse anyone's behavior if it's inappropriate or violent, but just to, to say, well, what's behind all this? Why, I even asked the question, why do we even have a term called air rage? I mean, we don't have bus rage or subway rage or train rage, and yet air rage is in the lexicon. And, again, I mean, I write in the book, what you just said, that, I point out that the first time I went to an airport, Kennedy Airport in New York, I was 5 years old.
Right.
I had on a tie and a white shirt and Chinese shoes, and I wasn't even flying. I was picked up, my family would pick up my brother coming home on leave from the Army. So, obviously an awful lot has changed. I can't remember the last time someone wore a suit and tie to pick someone up at an airport. Look, as I said, there's some good and there's some bad. I mean, what deregulation was aiming was to say, okay, there's no more jet set. This isn't just for the rich. We're going to let everyone fly. And in some ways, that certainly happened. But along the way, we've lost some things too. And I think, this book is an attempt to say, let's have a national dialogue. What do we want? Airlines are not, a luxury. They're not something that, is just a nice thing to have. They're something that they're absolutely intrinsic to the health of our country. I mean, everyone would agree on that. They're intrinsic to our economy, to making people and things move. They're intrinsic to our security, our defense. I mean, it would be equivalent to, to shutting down the interstate highway system to say, let's shut down the airline. So we need them, but yet, we haven't had any real national dialogue about what works and doesn't work in over 34 years now. So, this book, in a small way, if attention all passengers can help with that. There's just so much discontent. I mean, I'm not telling you anything you don't already know.
Right.
Every survey you see, ranks the airlines at the bottom of the pile, and people are very, very angry. But, this book is an attempt to say, well, look, you might be angry about $25 baggage fees, but let's look at even more serious issues, safety issues, and, where else are costs being driven down.
Yeah, I want to get into that in a minute. We're talking with William J. McGee, author of Attention All Passengers, and you talk in the book about the outsourcing, basically, of airlines, particularly regional airlines, where you may think you're on a United flight or whatever major airline you bought the ticket from, but basically they're run by a small regional airline. I just took a flight out to California last December. It was a United flight, but you look on the card in the back of the seat, and it was some airline I never heard of running that particular flight from Houston to California. So that's pretty prevalent now, isn't it?
Oh, it is. The book details how much the industry has changed in the last 10 years, since about September 11th. And, for me, like I said, I've been around the industry my whole life and been, working in it and writing about it for 27 years. But I have to say, in researching this and talking to people on the front lines, I learned an awful lot that I didn't know. So I have to assume most readers, that are not in the industry are also learning some new things. And one of the most striking things is probably the fact that, 53% of all airline departures in the United States now are operated by regional airlines. And that is, quite a statement that you sort of have to absorb that. For every 100 departures this hour, 53 of them are going to be regionals. And, in my view, the airlines, the mainline airlines, as the industry calls them, American, United, U.S. Airways, Delta, in many ways they've sort of abdicated the responsibility of flying on certain routes. And not just, traditionally regionals were used to go to rural cities and cities that, didn't have a lot of traffic. But now they're used on the busiest routes in the country, from New York to Washington, for example. And, the problem is, in my view, to an extent, they're abdicating their responsibilities. As you say, you buy the ticket on the mainline carrier, you book through their site, your credit card is billed by that airline, and, you get to an airport where all the signage and all the marketing and everything else is that airline. As you say, unless you read the fine print on the emergency evacuation card, you may not even be aware. And there are, there have been some good things come from the Department of Transportation to try to increase that awareness factor. But the fact is, I hear some readers every day who are still confused over this. And the more important thing is not just who's operating the flight, but what are the standards.
Right. There's
an entire chapter in Attention All Passengers devoted to regional carriers. And unfortunately, in my view and the views of many people in the industry, even though there's supposed to be one standard, there's really two standards with the mainline carriers and with regional carriers when it comes to safety.
I was going to say, the regional carriers, you talk about the safety issue, and not necessarily you're getting the best mechanics or even the best pilots. I was a little surprised when you said some of these regional airlines pay their pilots less than $10 an hour. I couldn't believe that.
Yeah, well, I think, the Colgan Air crash that took place in Buffalo 3 years ago, I think that was a bit of a wake-up call, and it received a lot of attention. And I think when people realized that the first officer on that flight, she was making less than $20,000 a year, flying for an airline that had Continental written on the side, even though she was flying for Colgan Air, that was a real wake-up call for a lot of people, because, we can name an awful lot of professions where, people are being paid better than that. In fact, she was forced to work as a waitress at one point to supplement her income. But beyond the pay issues, there's training issues. There's hiring qualifications. The industry and by law, it's supposed to be that there is one standard. But what we have found in recent years is that there are two classes of carriers. I spoke to the relative of a woman who was killed in that Buffalo crash, and she said to me, when we started researching it, we looked at it that the regionals were a farm team.
Yeah, that's a good way to put it. Well, what's the status now? I mean, again, I don't mean to keep going back when we were kids, but, it was a different airline world back then. Most of the pilots, I would assume, when we were flying as kids, or even young adults, or younger adults, that those guys were trained in the military. And came out of, whatever, Korean War, Vietnam War, whatever, as pilots. Where are the pilots coming from now? And anybody really want to be a pilot when there's not that much money to be made anymore?
Well, it's a real problem. There's no question. You're right. I mean, in the old days, I remember seeing a statistic that I think, in the post-World War II period, something like 80 or 85% of commercial pilots have been trained in the military. That's not the case now. There are a lot of, pilots are getting experience flying for very small airlines or for commuter carriers or for, air taxis and things like that, and they work their way up that way. But, the real concern is as was pointed out to me back when I worked in the industry, you sort of learn from osmosis sometimes. Older, veteran employees teach the younger veterans, and, the younger employees, excuse me. And, we're losing that to an extent. And I think where we see it most dramatically is with maintenance. There's been this dramatic upsurge in the last 10 years with outsourcing maintenance, in many cases outside the United States, developing countries, to El Salvador, to Mexico, to China, to Singapore. We're having work done on U.S. airlines, on their aircraft, by unlicensed, I'm using the word mechanics, but I'm using it in quotation marks because technically they're not even mechanics in many cases. They're maintenance technicians is what the industry is starting to call them. This is just a complete departure with how the industry has always worked. In my day when I worked at Pan Am, if a job was being done on an aircraft and there were 10 mechanics working on it, all 10 of them, working on that project, whatever it was, let's say it was changing an engine, all 10 were licensed by the FAA, and one of them signed off on it. Now what we have in many cases is, we have 10 unlicensed people doing the same job, but that one mechanic with a license still signs off on it. And according to the FAA, they're saying that's the same model. Well, I would argue that you need no experience in the aviation industry, or you don't need to know anything about airlines or airplanes to say, there's something wrong with that. Whether it's, a dentist or a barber or anyone, any kind of professional, to say that it doesn't matter whether you're licensed or unlicensed to do a job, I just can't accept that.
Yeah, it's a sobering thought, and especially now when these planes where I live right here near Sarasota. There's these planes that go up and down New York or the Atlanta route, and who knows how often they make those runs within a half hour of each other. Flipping back, they don't do a lot of maintenance in between those flights either on the same day. So who knows what's happening, right?
The good news is that airplanes are much better built than they ever were, and we've managed to work a lot of, bugs out of the system over the years, in some cases through tragic circumstances, and that's one of the reasons the system is safe as it is. And statistically, I want to be very clear, our industry is a very safe industry. But this book is a warning, and I know I'm sort of out there, and I'm making a case that, that things are going to get worse, and I certainly don't wish it, but the fact is, this is based on, not on my opinion, but, on the opinions of dozens and dozens of people that I've spoken to on the front lines, FAA inspectors, mechanics, pilots. They're very worried. We have an endorsement on the back cover of the book, Attention All Passengers, and it's from, someone who's very well known, Sully, Captain Chesley Sullenberger from, the U.S. Airways aircraft that landed in the Hudson River, and he did such a spectacular job there. And, a few years ago when he retired from U.S. Airways, he made a statement that I think we all need to listen to. He said, by any way you want to measure it, I'm not quoting him exactly, but his statement was basically, by any way you measure it, I leave an industry that is in worse shape than when I entered it. Now, that's a very sobering thing,
Oh, yeah.
And I think we all have to sort of stand up and say, well, what's going on here? I'm not being critical of the individuals that work in the industry. I think some people are perceiving that I'm criticizing, pilots or mechanics that don't have as much experience. I'm criticizing a system that is sort of being turned inside out. I want to see more Americans put to work, not fewer Americans. And, we've basically taken this industry and we've decimated it. And, if you're a service member now serving in Iraq or Afghanistan, you come back to the United States and you're a certified aircraft mechanic, well, there was a time where there was nothing better than to, make the jump from the military to, working in the airline industry. Now you simply can't do that.
Yeah.
If you did, you're not going to be making a living wage in many cases. So, we have to sort of ask ourselves, what are we doing? And, I think, quite frankly, the issues I'm bringing up about the airlines, I'm an airline guy, and that's all I write about. But I think these issues that I'm raising have to do with a much bigger picture issues of what's going on. I mean, why would we want to take such a skilled field like aircraft maintenance, in which Americans have traditionally been the best in the world, and give it away wholesale and put people out of work and ship these jobs to developing nations where uncertified people are doing the work? To me, it just makes no sense.
Mm. Yeah, and I didn't want to ask you before we run out of too much more time. I love talking about this. And by the way, your book is very fair too. I didn't get the impression you were ripping the airlines at all. I think you lay out your case very fairly to the people that are going to read it. So I just wanted to say that. But how about now? One thing I think it might be better. Maybe you can disagree with me or fill me in from the regulation days or before deregulation. It seemed back then there was a lot of flights that, remember when you figured you're flying into New York or big cities, you had to stack up for maybe a couple hours when you came in. I think they did away with that where they have to have an open slot for you before a flight takes off. So I think it eliminated a lot of the delays as far as that goes. Am I right about that, or is that erroneous?
Well, to an extent, yes, you are. There have been, it's a tough issue. It's an issue that, that still plagues us in some ways. Some airports, it's much more acute than others, And as someone who's a licensed dispatcher and used to work in flight operations, it was something I was intimately involved in for several years. And I worked at some tough airports. I worked for the Pan Am Shuttle, which I was very New York LaGuardia, Washington National, and Boston Logan. Those are three of the most congested airports on the planet. and we have hourly service, in some cases more than hourly. So, I certainly know what you're talking about with this. I mean, I'll share one thing with you. I had a reputation for bringing bad thunder with me, and my nickname at the Pan Am Shuttle was BC McGee, meaning Black Cloud McGee. It was clear days when I was off, and when I came in, the fog and the rain and the thunderstorms started. So I know what you're talking about, but at the same time, we have a system that right now in many markets, in many cities, many airports, it is trained to the capacity on a perfect day. The system is designed for an absolutely perfect day where, there is no bad weather, no air traffic control problems, no maintenance problems, no crew problems, no, security threats or anything else, and everything works beautifully. Well, obviously, there aren't too many perfect days. And, we saw it last week on the East Coast. There were thunderstorms that rolled in. And, I as soon as I heard about it last week, I said, I looked at the calendar and I said, sure, it's like June, that's what happens. And then the next thing you know, we're all reading reports and hearing things on the news and radio about massive delays and cancellations. And, of course, these things don't just affect a few airports. They affect the whole country, Yeah. And, I had a friend who was traveling last week to Europe and, missed his connection and lost the whole day as a business trip. But, it's not isolated incidents. And so, we really need to start looking at this and saying, well, look, if we're concerned about overcapacity, if we're concerned about, congestion problems, and by extension, there's another chapter in the book that deals with the environment. If we're concerned about the industry's, carbon footprint, then, let's ask ourselves, is it better to send up, 5 regional aircraft carrying 50 people each, or 1 larger aircraft carrying 250 people? Now, the airlines will say, well, customers want hourly service. But, when things go bad, there is no hourly service anyway. All the flights are going to be canceled. Well, I think we really need to step back and take some big picture issues here. It's a funny industry because, it's so intrinsic to everything that's important in this country. But at the same time, it's subject to, free market forces in the most violent way. And, what we have is that we really don't have any discussion about, well, what's the best way to use these airports? Is it, a congested airport like LaGuardia Airport? Does it make sense to have so many small regional airplanes in and out? They take up just as much space, as larger aircraft. In some cases, they require even more in-space separation. And, we don't have that discussion going on. I think it's time we had it.
Well, it's a fascinating book called Attention All Passengers. We've been talking with William J. McGee tonight on the show. And, William, you have a website? People get a hold of you, get a hold of the book?
Absolutely. The book just was released on Tuesday, June 26th, so it's available everywhere you buy books online and in stores. And I have a website, www.skywriting, spelled SKYWriting.com. And you can learn more there about it as well.
Great. Well, appreciate you taking a few minutes. It is a fascinating industry. It can be a lot of fun and it can be kind of hair-raising at times. But I think you shed some light on what's going on, and it's not too late to make the improvements. But I think we're coming down to a point where something has to be done soon, right?
Well, you just summed it up very well, actually. That's exactly what I wrote about Attention All Passengers, because, I thought, we really need to have a national dialogue about this before things get much worse. We need to talk about these things. Because, pretty soon it'll be too late, and we won't be able to say, all maintenance work has been outsourced outside the United States. It's too late to do anything about it. We need to address these issues now.
Attention All Passengers is the name of the book. We've been talking with William J. McGee tonight. William, thanks for joining us, and hopefully we can do it again down the road.
Absolutely. I'd be happy to. You can call me anytime.